Hello, everyone. You're at the Beyond Expo, International Technology Innovation Expo in Macau. So today's virtual panel is about how would United Nations leverage technology for Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, and conversations among technology leaders in the UN system. My name is Jingbo Huang. I'm the director of the United Nations University Research Institute in Macau. So I'm very happy to have three wonderful panelists and also my UN colleagues and friends in the United Nations system. And first, let me just introduce them to you. Yuping Chen, and she's the Senior Program Officer, Office of the United Nations Secretary General's Envoy on Technology. And she coordinates and oversees follow-up work on Secretary General's roadmap for digital cooperation and high-level panel. And later we'll hear more about her work. Robert Opp, and he is the Chief Digital Officer at United Nations Development Program, and he leads UNDP's digital transformation and organization-wide effort to harness the power of new technology to improve the lives of a vulnerable population. Jonas Svensson, and he is the head of Global Innovation and Technology at United Nations Office for Project Services, and he's heading the Sustainable Investment in Infrastructure and Innovation, S3I, which is based in Helsinki. Welcome, Yuping, Robert, and Jonas. Okay, so all of us are working on technology for SDGs. So I'm really curious to hear from each one of you, how does each UN organization approaches technology for SDG from your own specific angle? Shall we start from lady first, from Yuping?
Thank you, Jingbo, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this august panel. I think I'll start with the basics, which is that I think we all recognize how transformative technology can be to the achievement of the SDGs and how it really is incumbent on the United Nations as an organization to use technology better in helping us achieve the SDGs. It's been estimated, for instance, that 230 million digital jobs will be created in sub-Saharan Africa by 2030, which will generate $120 billion in revenue. So in some ways, really it behooves us to make sure that technology is fundamentally an enabler to achieving the SDGs. But our experience in COVID has made us realize how technology, and digital technology particularly, is ubiquitous to our lives, but also that many people are left behind by this digital revolution, such that, for instance, 3.8 billion people still remain unconnected to the internet. And in COVID, for instance, 1/3 of the world's children were unable to access education because they didn't have connectivity. So in achieving the SDGs, it's not also about the transformative potential of technology, but also the fact that so many actually need technology to achieve basic SDGs such as health and education. And this is where I do think that really it is about the UN system coming better together around technologies, harnessing their benefits while addressing their challenges and concerns. The fact that during COVID, for instance, the rise in the amount of cybercrime, the vulnerabilities of children and women online to online harms was raised because of increased level of digital activities is something that we need to look at as well as we talk about the impact of technology on the SDGs. This is why the United Nations system has resolved to come better together to do this precisely through the Secretary General's roadmap on digital cooperation, which you had mentioned, which lays out the Secretary General's vision of a more open, free, and secure digital future for all. It lays out very concrete actions in the areas of universal connectivity, digital human rights, digital capacity building, digital inclusion, all of which are meant to get us towards this approach of using technology for its benefits while addressing its challenges. This is something that the Office of the Tech Envoy at the United Nations headquarters is working to coordinate with all stakeholders, all parts of the UN system around this vision of the Secretary Generals.
Wow. Thank you, Yuping, for sharing the Secretary General's roadmap for digital cooperation and also your office work. Shall we move on to Robert, please?
Sure. Thanks, Jingbo. It's really a pleasure to be here with you and the other panelists as well. Good friends and colleagues. Very much as Yuping said, we look at what's happening in terms of the world of technology and the kinds of benefits that it can offer to the pursuit of the Sustainable Development Goals. Certainly one way that we look at technology is how it can be leveraged as a tool. But the other issue is that technology is actually an important part of the development context now. In other words, changes to the digital world are affecting people globally, whether you are in the least developed country or whether you're in Europe or North America. Technology is bringing all sorts of changes to the actual context. So it's really, as the UN's development arm, UNDP really needs to look at how we stay relevant to the challenges that our partners face. And we primarily work with governments and communities around the world. We have presence in 170 countries where we are engaging with our local partners to identify how they can better support their achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals in both of those ways, understanding the changing context as well as using new tools. And this is one of the reasons why UNDP launched a digital transformation effort for the organization itself. And that digital transformation covers both the internal systems of the way that we work, so our own digital core, our own systems, but also the way that we are changing and need to change and reimagine our programs that reach our partners. And so this has led to a proliferation of many different digital responses worldwide to all sorts of things, from blockchain for small producers, traceability and track and tracing kinds of applications, to use of advanced analytics, and many things that are happening on the ground. And these were happening even prior to COVID. Post-COVID emergence, we've seen an explosion of that even further. And so the organization, what we do as a digital transformation team is really look at how we can harness all of that power and all of the challenges that come along with it as well, and look at some of these big things that need to be tackled, like the digital divide, as Yuping said, how we really bring together inclusive digital transformation in the communities that we work with. So, and we do that, of course, under the context of the Secretary General's Digital Cooperation Roadmap, which Yuping mentioned, and how we work with our partners across the system, as well as private sector partners, to make all of that happen. So I'll leave it there for now, but that's sort of the basic approach that we're taking.
Thank you, Robert, for the overview of UNDP's digital transformation work. Jonas, please.
Right. So as my colleagues have pointed out, the digitalization and equality that drives when we can facilitate that is important. Same time, it's important to remember that technology does not equal just digitalization. It comes with many other things. One hurricane making landfall in North America runs $21 billion worth of cost, according to NOAA. And hence, we also need to implement new technologies when it comes to infrastructure, create new ways to basically build and maintain infrastructure facing these new challenges that we are standing in right now. The current COP points to that, and we're all aware of the challenges that climate change brings. So technology overall is an important task for all of us to either be early adapters, help to coordinate policy frameworks, and ensure that there is test beds to try out new things that are being created by researchers and universities around the world.
Thank you, Jonas. You all mentioned, gave us an overview of your work, and to let the audience know more concretely what each organization has been doing, and would you please share some of some concrete projects? What are some of the initiatives or projects that you're working on right now? And whoever wants to start is okay.
I mean, I can jump in, Jingbo, I guess.
Sure, please.
So as I mentioned before, we see many different projects, and too many to mention really. So maybe I'll just use the example of what's come out as a result of COVID, actually, in terms of response. So we saw, as COVID started to impact governments, we saw some very basic kinds of uses of digital. So in other words, just like all of our organizations went remote, many of the communities and governments that we partner with had to go remote and needed to adopt a whole new framework of remote working. So leveraging connectivity to do that. But then we started to see lots of different examples of concrete digital projects, like new e-commerce platforms that were being put in place that would specifically reach informal sector participants. So, for example, we partnered in Uganda with a local e-commerce company called Jumia to put about 3,000 farmers and small producers and traders on that were previously in the informal economy onto a platform where they were able to trade online. And so we saw lots of examples of how commerce and business was able to continue as a result of a move to a online platform. We also saw, of course, governments massively scaling up social protection programs on using mobile money and those kinds of platforms, as well as all sorts of services in many countries, including Bangladesh. We saw entire virtual courts systems going online. So we saw, thousands of court judgments and processes were able to continue in Bangladesh because of those platforms that were quickly put in place, building on infrastructure that had been there before. And then we saw also countries looking at how to adopt the right policy framework for what they're doing. So as countries looked at platforms like contact tracing through mobile platforms, what are the kinds of policies that need to be put in place around issues like data privacy and protection, and the usage of new technologies? And so how were you able to kind of create that enabling environment and an enabling ecosystem to be able to support those kinds of platforms? So those are just a few of the examples of what we've seen in terms of concrete projects.
So I have a follow-up question, Robert. What was the role of your team or UNDP in general?
Sure. Well, in many cases, UNDP receives requests from our partners to actually provide a certain kind of support. And so what we were doing, my team is a digital transformation team, and we were actually busy working on all sorts of things when COVID hit. But we had to pivot very quickly to kind of respond to these signals that were coming out of countries in these new areas of exploration. And so what we did was a lot of very rapid knowledge sharing across countries that were engaging in very similar approaches, using similar technologies, but connecting them to make sure that they're able to learn from one another. In some cases, very rapidly sourcing technical expertise so that we could get either consultants or vendors on the ground to provide support that's needed. In other cases, I have people who work in technology on my team, so they were actually able to jump in and look at some of the tech platforms themselves. And then in cases where it sort of goes to the more policy end, we've been really working to support governments in their own thinking toward digital strategy, their own digital strategies for their national level digital ecosystems. And that's something I can come back to if you'd like in a second, but it's really just about how do we kind of support the cohesive strategic level of using digital for entire nations.
I see that UNDP bridges both sides. One is the policy, the other is the concrete implementation. You mentioned the knowledge transfer. So I would like to invite Jonas to share with us, because last time during our conversation you did mention that UNOPS, your office, is playing a role of a convener. You're bringing different stakeholders together. It's a very concrete work. So would you like to share some projects with us, please?
Right, thank you. And yes, one of the key features and mandates of UNOPS is to be an implementing partner. We do execute projects and have a very hands-on focus. One key challenge right now for everyone is that we are facing a lot of problems. Climate change, overall the SDGs and so on and so forth. Some of them are very difficult to solve or come to terms with if we utilize the things we know today. So we need to basically drive R&D and innovation to find solutions for that. And one of the things that we are doing is that we have been rolling out an innovation center program where we combine different skills from different countries and markets, and we create crossovers. And one such crossover you can find if you look at the Innovation Center on Antigua, where we have a startup using AI to predict landfall for Sargasso seaweed, which is a health hazard, and also it impacts negatively on infrastructure in general. And then on the other hand, we have another team out of the center in Sweden, Origin by Ocean, who take down seaweed to the molecular level and extract food molecules, medicines, cosmetics, and so on and so forth. And by facilitating their meeting, we now have a supply source for a dangerous seaweed, but because it's dangerous, it also contains a lot of valuable substances. And hence, collecting and withdrawing those substances provides and generates value then on both locations. And here is a role where I see not only for us at UNOPS, but for a UN wider perspective, that the UN as a whole, we're very well positioned to identify challenges because we are in so many locations. Now, I wouldn't be bold enough to say that we are the best people in the world to solve these challenges. But because of our positioning in identifying the challenges, I do believe that we have an attraction power to attract the talent and the solutions. And that's where I see, and that's where I want to be with what we are doing right now.
Talking about attraction power, I would like to turn to Yuping, because I remember in the past couple of years, your office has led a lot of consultation efforts related to the digital roadmap. So would you like to share something?
Thanks so much, Jingbo. And actually, in some ways, Jonas's seaweed example about how the UN can convene on practical things is mirrored by what we try to do, as you've mentioned, at a bigger level, sort of more the political normative level, where we're bringing together stakeholders, member states, UN agencies, as well as private sector firms, NGOs, civil society, technical community, to have these high-level thematic discussions precisely on what Jonas and Rob has identified, these digital challenges, these problems, these areas where the United Nations can play a role as the convener to bring together all these players to think about what we need then to address these global technological digital challenges. So in the context of the roadmap, as you've mentioned, in the areas of universal connectivity, digital human rights, our roundtables talk about what is needed in terms of bringing the international community forward. And there's been a number of concrete outcomes that we hope will pave the way for us collectively to find solutions and ways of addressing these challenges. So for instance, under the work of the International Telecommunications Union, there will actually be a framework, a measurement tool, and a way of defining universal meaningful connectivity, because we've talked a lot about the people who don't have access to the internet and are left offline, but it's not just a matter of connecting them and having them have physical access to connectivity. It's also about making sure that that type of connectivity is meaningful in terms of their ability to use that connectivity, as well as affordable, because a lot of times the barrier to them actually using the internet is not the fact that there is no physical infrastructure in place, but simply the fact that it's unaffordable in their local context. So universal meaningful connectivity and what that actually means. We're also looking at defining digital inclusion, for instance. What does it mean to have a digitally inclusive society such that people are fully empowered in their use of the internet across all sectors and vulnerable groups as well? We're also looking at areas such as digital public goods and use of open source technologies across the UN system. And this is where, for instance, UNDP is playing quite a key role as an innovator within the UN system in using these types of open source technologies. I would also be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that our office, working with Rob's team at UNDP and ITU, are really pioneering this idea of a more coordinated, global, and coherent approach to digital capacity building, really trying to match what is on offer now with the needs of countries, backed by the ability of UNDP to have that presence across the world in so many locations, and really understanding what is the local need and what do countries actually need to bring about inclusive digital transformation, and making sure that really technologies are used in the local context and in countries to serve the peoples and communities that don't have access or really do need it to bring about the empowerment and the achievement of the SDGs that we've talked about. So digital capacity building is a key focus of the implementation of the Roadmap for Digital Cooperation, and we've really been helped by the solid work of champions like ITU and UNDP in carrying this forward. I would also say that the work of the office is also looking at what comes next. And this is where, for instance, the Secretary General's recently published Common Agenda lays out a global digital compact, which is an understanding, a coming together of, again, the multi-stakeholders, not just governments, but the private sector, civil society as well, to see what are the key principles for the digital future that we want, and to see if there can be certain types of commitments and pledges that we all agree on to reach this global compact of sorts and understanding on what it is that we actually do need to serve the people and communities around the world. So that's also another area of work where the UN will serve as a convener for these types of global discussions on the digital future that is so sorely needed right now.
Yuping, you already answered my next question. You probably read my mind. So my next question to all the panelists is, what is the strategic direction where your organization is heading into? So you mentioned the digital agenda. I would like also to hear from UNDP and UNOPS, what is your strategic direction? And in another word, how does success look like for you or for your organization?
Right. So maybe I can go first on this one then. Sure, I'll take it. From our perspective, I would say right now there are two sort of main paths that we have foreseen. And one is the internal path, basically implement innovation and technology in our internal processes in a way to catch up with what is sort of norm outside of the UN system. And in some ways perhaps even play an early implementation and adaptation partner. Then you have the external, which is then more towards implementation of projects for clients and the utilization of technologies that we identify and solutions that we help create. And there we have created this sandboxed environment called S3I, where we are allowed to play a little bit differently within the UN framework when it comes to procurement and so on and so forth. We can create partnership with new entities that allows us to basically field test solutions, and that way hopefully then can cut down the time for implementation. So those are the two pathways where we are right now, and where we're going is hopefully for UN-wide adoption of this kind of test beds, so that we can move as a whole to implement solutions wherever they are needed, rather than waiting for others to do that. So that's basically it.
Robert, please.
And Jingbo, from our side, it's actually really interesting because we also speak about two pathways. In fact, that's in our digital strategy, which we created a digital strategy a couple of years ago, but we're updating it now. The general strategic direction here is that we need to really work on closing the digital divide and promoting inclusive digital ecosystems worldwide that leave no one behind. In other words, we actually say we want to create a world in which digital is an empowering force for people and planet. But within that, we have sort of two areas. One, as Jonas said, one is internal and one is more externally focused. Internally, it is continuing the transformation that we've launched on improving our digital core and making sure that our internal systems are fit for purpose for supporting the future of the organization in all the sort of forms of service delivery and systems that we have. More externally, we have two main focus areas, and one is to ensure that across all of the thematic areas in which UNDP is involved, such as climate change, programming, renewable energy, gender, women's economic empowerment, poverty eradication, resilience. Across all of those areas, we need to work to embed a sort of strategic digital approach so that we're actually enabling better and more effective development outcomes as a result of using digital technologies. The second area of our external pathway is really looking at this area I mentioned before. How do we really work with partners on really creating inclusive and whole of society digital transformation with all the different parts that entails, from policy level and strategy and planning down to the sort of fundamental pieces of digital architecture and infrastructure that need to be in place. And so that is an area where we don't just look at things like how do we introduce technology to deliver better benefits for citizens, which is certainly a piece of it, but it's also how do we mitigate against those challenges, and that Yuping was mentioning in particular. So it's addressing the digital divide, it's understanding how to combat misinformation, to identify where digital is actually driving extremism and polarization, and making sure that we are able to keep political processes open and fair. It's all of those kinds of things in there when we take a whole of society lens to digitally inclusive transformation of those kinds of countries.
Thank you, Robert. So Yuping, even though you already answered my question, do you have some words to add to this? So what is the strategic direction?
I mean, I will just very quickly echo what colleagues have said about there being an internal way, which is that the UN system really needs to get better coordinated across the board so we can serve and deliver as one UN. And in some ways, it is particularly important to do this in countries and not necessarily at headquarters. And this is where I think the work of the agencies which are on the ground will be so critical. And that externally, how we as the UN present ourselves as a convening space, but also a leader when it comes to calling for these use of technologies in a beneficial way to societies, to communities, to the environment, is also really important. I also want to also touch on something that I think has been assumed but not necessarily articulated so explicitly, this idea that this has to be done in a multi-stakeholder fashion, engaging as many communities as possible, not just the traditional UN way of discussion, negotiation, and agreement. And I think this is particularly important in the digital arena because it is quite clear that to address digital challenges, we do need private sector companies, tech giants at the table, as well as civil society and communities and individuals. So it really will have to be this coming together of all people around that table so that we can have these external conversations and these decision points going forward. So that particular part of the external engagement, I do think is particularly important for the UN to lead by example and continue partnerships with external organizations, with governments, as well as with private sector and civil society organizations on these issues.
Interesting point on the partnership, and that makes me think of the next question, which is how do you think, based on your own experience, the UN as a whole, and also together with the stakeholder and the partners, should leverage the technology for SDGs? So you just talked about your individual organization's point of view, but UN as a whole, and together with the rest of the stakeholders, how will we do this?
Well, I can jump in, Jingbo, on a piece of that, which is sort of building on what Yuping just said. You know, when we, for example, I was talking about a whole of society approach to digital transformation. First of all, that's inherently a multi-stakeholder issue. That's not, we're saying whole of society, not whole of government. Whole of society means that you have to take into account civil society, business ecosystem, in many cases the startup or innovation ecosystem that's present, people and their general level of digital literacy, as well as government and regulatory frameworks and things like that. So that's certainly kind of a multi-stakeholder platform that needs to be pursued. Otherwise, it's going to be very asymmetrical. The other element is what Jonas was mentioning before, which is, you know, the UN is not going to be a tech powerhouse, right? I mean, we need to have digital skills, technology skills, data skills, but we're not going to be producers and developers of the main platforms. But we certainly should be able to partner with those who do have those expertise and those kinds of abilities to really work at the cutting edge. And so that's why it's so important to find the way to build those kind of innovative partnerships across the private sector, academia, civil society, others, to bring those sectors together, as Yu Ping said, and really have a conversation that covers holistically those kinds of areas. I would say we see this really importantly in some of the crossover areas, because there's so much going on that kind of may have traditionally been done in sectors, but digital kind of gives a sort of horizontal bridge across them. And the interaction of digital technologies and sustainability, which Jonas mentioned before, is one of those areas. And we've been exploring that in a kind of like a global policy sense, together with the German Environment Agency, Future Earth, the International Science Council, and the UN Environment Program, in a coalition partnership called CODES, this Coalition for Digital and Environmental Sustainability, to really look at the issues that face that nexus, which include both understanding how technology can be more sustainable in the sort of carbon emissions and that sort of angle, as well as how technology can contribute to climate change mitigation and sustainability overall. So it's really important to have a lens on partnership when it comes to digital technologies.
Thank you, Robert. Jonas?
Yeah, to echo what Robert said, I also agree with that. I do believe that we have a very important role to play as a facilitator, to bring the people to the table. And to add to the horizontal bridge, we also need the vertical ladder, because it's not just going to be newcos or startups with new solutions. We will also need the small and medium-sized enterprise with their part of the puzzle, and the large multinationals. And when we sort of can combine all of those elements together, then perhaps at the end of the day we will have a solution that actually can tackle one of these main issues that we have collaboratively placed under the SDGs.
Thank you. Yu Ping, do you have any other thing to add to this?
Just to say, I agree wholeheartedly with my colleagues. I think it's a big challenge, and this is really why we need everybody and all hands on deck for it.
Thank you. So UN is the convener, is the facilitator. So my last question for today's panel is actually about, I'm asking on behalf of the audience. They are non-UN people. How can they get involved in each UN organization's work?
Well, I would say that now that there is a coordinating body under the Secretariat, which we're blessed to have present here with us today, that's a starting point. The drive for one UN is another important piece to that puzzle, I believe. And then forums like United Nations Innovation Network, which Robert has been co-chairing for many years, is also an important sort of lessons learned table where anyone in the UN family and beyond can take part and share and learn from all other colleagues. So I think that we have a few solid tools in the toolbox. It's just a matter now to teach our colleagues and perhaps ourselves to utilize these tools in a broader sense.
Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly with that. I would also say that, as Jonas mentioned, and also within UNDP, we have partnerships across the board. So if you're if you're running a startup and you're doing something in this space, there are ways to get involved in, just, I think, look at our websites, you'll understand where we have accelerator programs and the sandbox type stuff that Jonas spoke about. So there are ways to engage on that sense. If you are in academia and you are researching, we need more people to put research into how these technologies and are mixing with issues like sustainability and others to really what it's going to mean for people, the impacts on people, and the positive and the challenges. So we need to understand better how technology is driving the social environment and therefore the impact on the SDGs. And we are going to, all of our agencies, I believe, are going to need to take on new skills over time, that people who are skilled in data areas and understand technical systems and things like that, that we won't have massive numbers of developers, as I said before, but we need people who can be translators between the worlds. And so as the demographics within our organizations shift and people retire, we need to be taking on a new generation of people that have that skill set and that outlook and mindset as well.
I think from our office, as Jonas has mentioned, we are supposed to be, in some ways, the first port of call for private sector companies, civil society that are seeking to engage with the UN. So feel free to reach out to our office and we can connect you to the correct UN agencies, be it UNDP or UNOPS, ITU, or so forth, that are working in this digital space. So it's a very simple introduction to the UN. You can try our office, and we really do welcome this type of engagement. I would also say that going forward, especially as the UN works towards building the Global Digital Compact, we really do need to hear from everybody around the table, everybody on the ground, and everybody working in the technology field as to what they think is crucial that governments, private sector, and civil society all collectively agree on in terms of the vision of the future that we want for the digital space. So that consultation and public inclusivity is something that our office will be working on in the next year or so, leading up to the Secretary General's proposed Global Digital Compact in September 2023. So that process of open public consultations, I think, will continue, and it's a really good way to get engaged in these key issues of deciding what is the digital future you would like to see.
Thank you for the inspiring conversation. And actually, if for the people outside of the UN, they may think UN as just one organization. And as Yuping said, we deliver as one, but we take different angles. For example, Yuping's office, the Tech Envoy's office, is more from the policy level overview, the direction related to tech and SDG. And from Roberts, it's both policy and implementation. And from Jonas is innovation, infrastructure, so investments. And so from the organization where I am in, United Nations University, is research. So research on the digital technology for SDG. So within the UN system is really a broad, a world by itself. So thank you for also sharing and calling for participation from the audience. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for calling for participation. And I hope the interested audience will be able to join the UN work. SDGs is not only about the UN, it's about everybody.